Now, conscience and adequate anthropology, you notice that I didn't have a separate section on conscience within the syllabus. But we're going to be talking about it in various places. We'll talk about it tonight. We will talk about it when we get to virtue theory, because prudence, really the subjective parts of prudence are how we form our conscience. So we'll talk about it in various ways. And adequate anthropology, to use John Paul II's term, just this understanding of the human person, we'll develop that tonight, but we're going to just keep this. We're almost into the meat of the course now. So the first week was an introduction. Then we had 2 weeks of like historical surveys. Tonight is really what I would call absolute foundational moral theology. When no matter where I give a talk, like a 2-hour talk on theology, it starts here. If we don't get the understanding of freedom down right, if we don't have an adequate anthropology, understanding of the human person, then everything else that's said, from medical moral issues to immigration to contraception, makes no sense. So this is a real foundational beginning for this. Freedom, obviously, as it conforms to the good as found in the nature of the human person, is also a fundamental aspect of that adequate anthropology. So the first thing we'll do before the break is talk about the various aspects of freedom. Some of this stuff I got from various introduction to moral theology textbooks. Some of it from Pinckaers, some of it from William May, some of it from Romanus Tresario. So anyway, and I think if I recall right, this came from Romanus Tresario. But anyway, he lays a few different types of freedom. And he says the first one is what they call philosophical freedom. And this is pretty much just the fact that we have free will. So we have a radical capacity to choose as human beings. Another type of freedom, and this is really an introduction, is psychological freedom. We now can start choosing as a means to an end. Well, in other words, we can look ahead almost like telos. We can look ahead and see what we're trying to achieve, and we choose in direction towards that. So we have a goal in mind when we're making our choices. This is really the psychological freedom, at least Romanus Tresario says, is where we're starting to have some virtues and morality informed. All right, so we're not just talking about the capacity to choose, but we're now talking that I can choose between various goods based on what I'm choosing is good for me as a human person. So as a means to an end. You'll hear more about that as the weeks move on. And through psychological freedom, we develop character. Okay. Now we'll talk about this a few slides down. This is from Veritatis Splendor in your reading, theonomy. So there's the reason and the will that are both interacting, right? And when we are choosing, we're actually participating in God's wisdom and His providence. Theonomy cannot be something imposed on us. Now, not everything has been decided or revealed from God as to what we should or should not do. So we need this freedom, and Christ and the church, fully expects us to use our human will to make determinations, because not everything is simply a choice between a good and a bad. Sometimes we are choosing between competing goods. And this is where we have to bring our intellect and our will to bear on that. So in His wisdom, He left many things to our own determination. And this could be anything from choosing our vocations in life, to choose to take theology rather than some other course. A lot of things are left to, we're not fatalist, that there was only one path we could have chose. And all along the way, God's, allowing us to participate in our freedom as long as we are bringing our reason and our will to bear. Anyway, we'll talk more about John Paul II here in a little bit. Oh, see, if I would just paid attention, it was coming up next. All right, so Romanus Tresario talks about 3 accounts of theological freedom. Now, he actually gets this from Mortimer Adler. Has anybody ever heard of Mortimer Adler? You have?
Yeah.
He wrote a book, How to Read a Book, which my kids always thought was the funniest thing in the world. He wrote a book, How to Speak, How to Listen. He wrote Aristotle for Everyone. But he also wrote a book, I wouldn't say it's my favorite, but it's up there, called The 6 Great Ideas. He talks about beauty, truth, and goodness. That's, by the way, how we make judgments. And then liberty, justice, and equality. These are things that we act on. So he calls those 6 ideas the 6 great ideas upon which we know and when we act. So Romanus Tresario gives a shout out to Mortimer Adler and says, through his surveying of all various religions, he's found 3 accounts of theological freedom, and he lists them. The first one is the model of self-realization. So at this level, we are just finding some subjective fulfillment. Okay? How can we fulfill ourselves subjectively? He says the next account would be the model of self-determination. Now we're trying to base our choice and our decisions in reference to some usefulness. You will learn later when we go over ethical systems, proportionalism. We're trying to weigh out the goods. So that's another account of theological freedom. But he says, too, he's found in his surveying of religions, a third, the model of self-perfection. Now, this is always measured by its purpose, like what are we doing? And its telos, what's the goal? Which are often not that far apart. This is what Pinckaers, in your reading, you should have picked up on. He's listing as the freedom of excellence. So, yes?
Is this the same thing that Pinckaers says about the infancy stage and then the adulthood is the last one, the self-perfection?
I don't know how we'd line up with this, but we're going to cover that precisely. But that's good that you picked up on that. I don't think so, because this wouldn't, it might. There's got to be overlap. Anytime people make lists on various types of freedom, there's going to be some overlap. I don't know if that was Cesario's point, but I think you could probably make some sort of lineup for that, nonetheless. Any questions? Okay. His freedom of indifference. This we could sum up, if we had to, in I will to choose. Something to think about. Does anybody remember the gospel from Sunday? The leper.
Yeah, if you choose to heal me.
Yeah, and then Christ responded, I will it so. I thought, well, I wonder how we should interpret that. Was that an intellect moving his will? Was that a will? I mean, I was reading anyway. I don't want to try to parse the scripture, but this is why I can't pay attention in Mass. I'm just admitting it. It's hard, right? Okay, so in freedom of difference, and we're going over this again. We've already kind of touched on this a little bit in a previous class, but this is where freedom precedes my intellect and will. So in order for me to preserve freedom, it can't be bound by anything. So the freedom, if you remember my little arrow diagram, it actually precedes both will and intellect. And it has to be formed by obligation. And I'll explain again why this is so. With freedom, in this particular instance, if you see freedom as something that has to be totally autonomous, then things like natural inclinations again, well, that would seem to inhibit our freedom, because that's a drive that's pushing us. Virtues, which are habits that are formed, that seems like it's a drive that's pushing us. So in Occam's view, how do we preserve freedom? Well, we have to put the choice of the will being free before these things. So before the intellect, before the will. I said it a little odd. We have to put our understanding of freedom before these choices of the will and the intellect. So then, what do we have in God's eyes to guide us? Because we can't use our natural inclinations. We can't see our design. Well, we have to use obligation. Why do we follow these rules? Because we are obliged to as Christians. We would follow the Ten Commandments because that's the laws that God has set out. So remember last week I tried to show you in that diagram that left a real disconnect between freedom and law. The law always seemed like it was something external that was coming to bear on our freedom. And it never really seemed like it was something that was in line with our nature that would allow us to actuate our freedom. So all he was trying to do here was nobody was arguing about whether or not we have free will. These were arguments about how does the will and the intellect interplay, and then what would be the logical outcomes of those decisions. Now, Pinckaers lines up, this is William of Ockham. He lines up Ockham, he lines up Aquinas. You already know just from me before saying that nothing ever falls into two categories so easily like that. There are some researchers that show natural law in William of Ockham. And first of all, Ockham doesn't speak for all Franciscans. So, so even though he lines it up like this, that's good. It helps us see things clearly. Not everything falls that neatly into categories. So we know that. But in this type of freedom, see, he's preserved us as having free will. But he's brought freedom to the extent where we are saying that we are free, even to the point where we will do away with inclinations and virtues, because we see those habits and those instincts, if we want to use that word, as something that inhibits our freedom. We wouldn't see, like a stop sign would be something against our freedom. We don't recognize that the stop sign helps with the good flow of traffic.
This is a tough question. Why was he so invested in this? Does it seem like...
You know, I think you asked something last week to this regard, like where did this start? These guys are often writing in opposition to one another. You know, you'll see Duns Scotus write in opposition to Aquinas, and maybe Alexander of Hales in opposition to him, and then Occam in opposition to them. So these guys were always trying to find what is good and what is an error in another, if you want to say a person, either contemporary or behind them. And then they try to say, well, that really doesn't work. You know, there are things in Thomas Aquinas' understandings that are problematic. Not that there's anything wrong with, I mean, he's an absolute genius, but you know, there are some things that are problematic that other scholars are trying to work through. So when these guys were talking about individuation, what makes you, me, and different than, you know, even though we share a human nature, what makes me and Frank two different humans? Well, they also want to talk about, well, how does freedom work in this? And how does the will interplay? So oftentimes, it's hard to say exactly what he was against, but my understanding is he would be probably opposed to Aquinas clearly on this.
I just want to make a comment, actually. It's when I look at these, you know, this brings back a memory of, you know, when I was out of college. And when I got married immediately upon graduation. And somebody came up to me and said, do you want to get married, or are you going to be stuck with that ball and chains, what they said? And I was like, no. I said, no. By getting married, I will be more free to do what I want. And people would look at me like I was nuts, you know, when I would say that. Is that somehow?
That's exactly, that would be the opposite of this. So you're speaking about Aquinas' freedom of excellence. So you see that there's a purpose and a design in what you're choosing, and that it allows you to live out your design more fully. Yeah, so if you can understand that as a contrast, you're on to it. That's exactly what this is. There were other ramifications for this. This means for the human person, again, to reiterate, that we do not have inclinations, and that our habits really aren't virtue-formed habits. They're pretty much psychological habits that we have just developed. So what does this mean? So if we are always choosing, if our freedom is so autonomous that we are always choosing, then what does that mean for God? So again, we come back to asking the question, is something good because God wills it, or does God will it because it's something good? If he wills it and that itself makes it good, then you're into voluntarism. All right, so this other names that are beyond this course, divine command theory. So God could have declared adultery good, and he could have declared marriage evil. It's what God wills. He is God, because don't we want our God to be free? Do we want our God to be bound by various laws? Doesn't sound like a very, omnipotent, powerful God that if he's bound by these things. So he's working this stuff out. Strictly speaking, that's voluntarism. There's, again, a large variety of, along that regard. Duns Scotus gets thrown into that, but it's much different with him. He does not, Duns Scotus brings the intellect into this decision in a very deep way, where Occam doesn't. But this was one of the ramifications. When we're trying to determine how does the will and the intellect interact, what is a logical outcome? A logical outcome is that we were going to have a God who pretty much just wills what is good and wills what is true. And if that is true, if you follow this path, and this is where you can break it down into your catechesis, if you don't think there's a nature, then the only way to follow what God wants is to go by the obligations he set forth for us. So you're going to wind up looking at everything as a rule that you have to follow, not realizing that there's some connection, like Billy said, to my genuine happiness and beatitude. That's the problem. Okay, well, we already talked about that. With the moralists, though, what would be our, before I move on, what would be our job as moralists? Our moralist is just to find out what is or is not obliged. So we don't ask questions about happiness and virtue and ends, like beatitude with God. We have to ask things basically along the lines of, is this permitted? Is this allowed? Should I not do this? So there you are seeing a childish type faith. Okay? And if you recognize some of this happening in what we covered in the manualist tradition from last week, that's Pinckaers' point, is that once this took hold, what happened then was so many reactions in the church, as he said, may have been what it may, the manuals may have done what they intended to do, but I think Pinckaers says they didn't do what the church needed. So we were addressing issues of conscience, what to do here, what not to do here, but we're really not basing that on the true nature of the human person and his goal for happiness, beatitude, and virtue.
Just one question.
Sure.
I don't know, it's too much.
No, go right ahead.
Obligation, so how is that a freedom? If we can choose the obligation.
Well, yes.
So that's the freedom part.
Correct, yes, you can choose the obligation. The obligation part is it's the only way that you would have access to what God wills to be true. Because there's no inbuilt, it'd be like, there's no way to really make a parallel with a car, but it would make a car that you're going to choose whether or not it really needs oil or not. In other words, you're not going to look at the actual owner's manual because you don't recognize a design that's inherent in it. It's just in this particular car, the designer wanted us to use oil. That just happened to be what he willed. So, in order for us to do what the owner...
So how do we know what the obligation is?
Well, this will be through Revelation and such, right? So the Ten Commandments and all tradition, Scripture and tradition, okay? Okay, we already talked about this. I'm getting ahead of myself in my as I talk. If as you guys do any teaching, my notes flow out of the head, and then I make the slides, and oftentimes I'm talking and I don't realize I put that up there already.
That's okay, you can go over it twice.
That's okay.
So we can.
Well, you had a good point last week about this. Sometimes this stuff needs to sink in because it is a different type of language, if you wanted to use that. And sometimes, especially this understanding of nominalism and its effect on law and freedom. Remember the aha moment, at some point something clicks. If you're like me, I have to go over it. I'm that slow of a thinker. But once you are out of the cave on all these little things, then it's going to seem obvious. I get that now. And then you'll have the same struggle explaining it to the next person and all they're going to hear is, whoa, 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 and you're going to try to say, no, this is why it is. So he says in this freedom of indifference that all we are choosing between two contraries, because we can't really point to something that's good for our nature. So we have these various choices, and he talks about atomization. All he means by that is that if you want to understand all our choices are punctuated and like almost staccato, you don't see like a line of movement from, towards virtue, towards happiness, towards beatitude. And it's going to leave law and freedom constantly in tension. And this is where I think you could easily make the case in a catechesis situation, because most people see things as the Ten Commandments or church precepts basically as some imposition on them. Why am I doing this? They want to know the why. Well, if you can connect it to the design of the human person, and that's always the trick, and get them away from simply asking questions about what's allowed or prohibited, why don't you ask what is good for me as a human person? And the way to start that is, do you believe there's a design to the human person? Yes. Who do you believe designed you? God. Does God know what your design needs? Yes. Then would anything that God say be that which would be good for you? Yes. Okay, so they're really not rules, are they? They're not even really guidelines. They're not even suggestions. They're God's love for you, saying this is how you can live your life well. Okay? Any questions? Oh, I already spoke about that. Where we're just, the reason why he calls it indifference, because it's really, there arises an indifference between these two. It's an absolute free choice. So whatever habits we develop just wind up being psychological mechanisms. They aren't true virtues that we are developing and building on. Okay, it's freedom of excellence. We could rephrase this now, rather than I will to choose, that I choose to will. So now, rather than freedom preceding the will and intellect, now freedom is the concept that proceeds from that. So now I will walk in this freedom. It's not a freedom of autonomy, where I'm looking at everything from it's being imposed on me from the outside. So the will is determined by the intellect. The intellect chooses the good and proposes it to the will. And the will acts forth from the good that was given to it. I didn't want to go any deeper on this because Pinckaers did. And the reality is there's a lot of variances and other ways to explain this, but I thought it's best to leave it at this level. The way that he preserves how we want to say we don't always choose right, well then why is that? Well, he'll say because an inferior good has been proposed to the will. Now that could be willful ignorance. I don't want to know the right thing to do. Or that could be invincible ignorance. For some particular reason, I'm unable to determine what is the right thing to do. Willful ignorance, as we get on to the course, we'll see, is a very serious sin. It's one of the only two, my personal note, I always tell people, the only two qualities I have for friendship is that there's no willful ignorance and there's no pretense. Once I get beyond those two things, I'm your best friend, because everything else is kind of accidental in my book. But if you ever spoke to somebody who doesn't want to know the truth, you've hit a dead end, all right? Okay, now these were what you were speaking about, the 3 stages in education of freedom. And we may have all been there. Maybe we go back and forth on these. I'm also lining them up with the 3 spiritual stages, for those of you that know about those. The stages of our spiritual life. So he says the first stage is the stage of discipline. Everything, all the laws appear external to us. And in your ministries coming in, you're going to be dealing with this on a regular basis because it is a step. And we look at the Decalogue and all its negative precepts, and negative precepts are what we use to guide us here. So a spiritual stage that would line up with this is the purgative stage. And he calls it the stage of our childhood. And the stage of progress would be lined up with our adolescence. So now we're starting to make and appreciate moral qualities. We're not just simply doing it because we understand it to be a negative precept. Don't do this, don't do that. Now we're starting, not looking for recognition or anything in particular. We're not even looking for like an end in itself. We're starting to love somebody a little deeper. And he said this, and you can line this up with the illuminative stage. And then finally, the stage of maturity. And this is the mastery of excellence. So, as Scripture says, we are maturing with the fullness of Christ. And this could line up with the unitive stage. Yes.
Does an individual, each part of humanity, have to go through all three of those stages?
I would think so on some level. And I wouldn't even think that, especially with these spiritual stages, depending on aspects of our own lives, we might be in flux. And maybe there are situations where, which I had a Protestant minister tell me once, when I was giving a talk on these stages, he said, but aren't they all still bringing you to what God wants in the gospel? Well, I said, sure. But who in goodness name would want to stay there? I don't want to, I don't want my child, my physical child, to obey me out of some fear. That would not really be something that I would, ascertain as a progress in a loving relationship. So yes, these are still, you're still on I guess the way he had put it, are we still on this side of the gospel? Well, sure. But we want to be mature Christians in the fullness of perfection of Christ. Who had it?
Yeah, and just the purgative, was that meant to be like purgatory? Is that-
Well, it's the same function.
Yeah.
There are, if there are habits or such that we're trying to rid ourselves of, it's purging. So if we don't know what else to do, the very least we can do is follow negative precepts. Like we would do as parents with young children. Don't do that. Don't do this. You're not really giving them the reasoning. Because at some point, you just simply want to see them, I hate to use the word obey, but comply. But then as they get older, we're hoping that they move into a stage where they start to appreciate the moral qualities behind the act that you're asking them to do. And eventually, you want them to love you for your own sake. And I'm not sure if there's... Yeah. If I don't have it here, I'll quick bring it up. Okay, I do have it. This is from St. Basil. I always throw this in. And again, this is all doing what's right, if you want to say it that way. But he talks about why are we doing what's right. He said, if we are doing what's right out of fear, because we're so afraid to go to hell, I don't want to go to hell. That's why I'm doing what the Ten Commandments ask of me. As that Protestant minister told me, are you on the right side of the gospel? Okay, but sure. But you're also in the relationship of a slave to God. You are, that's what slaves do. They act right out of fear. That's not the relationship we want. He then goes on to say, well, I'm going to do what God asked me because I want to go to heaven. As the song says, I want to go to the place that is the best. Well, that's not really a very mature spirituality. You're just a mercenary. You're a soldier for hire. You're looking for the reward. Is that better than not doing it? Okay, sure. But I don't want my children to do what I ask of them that's good for them for the hopes of some future inheritance. That would be not a very good relationship to have. Although they know my situation, they're not going to get anything. But nonetheless. Then, He says, if you listen to the gospel because of the love of God, now you are acting as a child to their parent. So yes, they all keep us on the right side of the gospel, to use that language. It's inaccurate, but to make the analogy easy. But why are we doing it? So we're moving from this childhood to adolescent to adulthood stage, from purgative to illuminative to the unitive.
Totally agree. And, you know, it's,
They're laughing. What's coming?
let's get practical right now. Like in our ministry was going to be, is
Yeah.
that what percent do you feel that people are stuck in stage one and stage one, let's go with. I bet you there's, in my opinion, more than half the people in church on Sunday, and that's only 20% of the Catholics.
Oh.
More than half, if not more than that, are in that first stage, or the second stage where you just said, I just want to go to heaven.
Well, it really is, and I think part of it, and you know, I don't think anything's going to change in the parishes. Has anybody read the document, Their Hearts Are Burning Within Them? I can't remember if it was a CDF document or a USCCB document, but they said the first...
Billy says it sounds familiar.
It sounds familiar. Well, good for you, Billy. It said that we need to catechize adults.
Yeah.
Children are secondary. Try that in a parish. Try to replace the CCD. First of all, it doesn't say to get rid of the CCD program, or what's it called now? Prep. Okay. But it says if we don't, you know as well as I, anybody that's ever worked in that program, that parents who never go to Mass are dropping their kids off because they want to get the confirmation merit badge, and they go home to a family that there is no support for what they've just learned. So we've got it backwards. We have such poor adult catechesis. So the emphasis should be on adult catechesis. But good luck getting that across in a parish. It'll be met with all kinds of hailstorm. But that's part of the problem. So what happens then is people go to 8th grade, they graduate, and we see them when somebody gets married, right? So what are they left with? They are left in one of these lower stages because that's all they've ever really been engaged at. Not that just because a person's in 8th grade doesn't mean they have to be at that stage, but that's all they can remember from that is don't do this, do that. So they are stuck in this stage where everything appears external to them. Because let's face it, if you honestly accept that we are made in God's image and He knows what is good for us, and then He reveals to us ways that we can exemplify our freedom, that's going to compel you to change. So your only hope is to disregard this or to poo it off as what do they know.
Nice. So the purgative, eliminative, and unitive, and I'm asking this to the class, and I'm asking it to you too. I think that was what Father Billy had like as a spiral
Yes,
staircase.
the 3 stages of spiritual life.
That was it. That was
Correct.
it, the spiral staircase that you can go
Absolutely.
up and down.
And I'm just throwing these in here.
Right.
Pinckaers didn't. But I don't see why they wouldn't add up to that. Yeah.
Like a lot of things in life.
It certainly is. Well, again, now here's the difference, is that what happens when people get hit between the eyes? Oftentimes, these become impetuses for them to return, which is why so many priests and you deacons that preside at funeral liturgies, you're not being pastoral to the sense where you're compromising, but you realize this is an evangelization opportunity. So how do then I meet with this? Okay, the truth will make you free. So we all know this from Scripture. If you continue my word, you are truly my disciples, and you will know the truth, and the truth will make you free. If you read this in context, we're descendants of Abraham. We're just, Moses freed us. We're not under slave to anybody. They're not quite getting it, right? So this idea, and freedom of being autonomous is not unnecessary. Not being a captive to somebody is a necessary freedom. It's not the type of freedom that we're speaking about today. So it goes on to say anybody who commits a sin is a slave to sin. All we have to do is figure out how do we let people know. And here's one way you can do. If you want like little, and these are not unique to me. These are things I've either heard, thought of myself, I forget. Anybody who's an artist knows the phrase that you're only as creative as the obscurity of your sources. So if nobody knows where you got something from, you're going to look like you're a smart little guy. But the reality is, we get this when it comes to health and eating. Nobody is going to go on a chocolate diet with milkshakes and popcorn, and this is all they eat. They will admit, well, unless you're my wife, she gets away with that. Her joke is, I eat food sometimes. But we understand that there's a design to our health, and that the closer that we can eat according to that design, the freer our health would be. And that there are things that include anything from over drinking, too much smoking, too many, anything, right? That impedes our health. So there's a bridge. People who don't even believe that we have a human nature know that we can understand the human dietary system and how that contributes to our health. Why do we try so hard to match, some of us, why do we try so hard to match our eating habits and our sleeping habits to the design of our personal health? Okay, if you can understand that, then there might be a bridge to start talking about why it is we have other aspects of our design and our nature that we could also know. And it's the same level of freedom that we're after. So anybody who can't put the cupcake down is a slave to the sugar, right? I mean, there's a jump there. So there are different types of freedom. Obviously, the lower is an absence of physical constraint. And the higher level, an absence of psychological compulsion. And this does come from the article that you read, John Paul II and the Truth About Freedom. And if I remember right, in the article, rather than heteronomy, so the heteronomy was the external rules, the rigid demands, because that could create cultural situations that really destroy our freedom, I think Dulles said. See, I have it up there. I should just... And also rather than autonomy, which is, another way that somebody might see freedom, where we are suspicious of all norms and values. This is really like moral anarchy. So rather than heteronomy or autonomy, we're going to go back to what was on a previous slide and what John Paul II says we are after complete agency. By agency, I mean freedom. We are not going to follow blind obedience. We do not want to be childish. We want to be self-determining individuals. And he says that's the concept that he proposed as theonomy. I will be ruled from within, and I will determine goods, and those are desires that are in line with my nature, and in that way I will be free. So maybe if Jesus would have had PowerPoints, he could have told the Jewish people that, oh no, I'm not talking about that type of freedom. So when they had thought, well, we have not been under any rule for some time. We are free people. He says this isn't just about lack of physical constraint. This isn't it's not even just simply not having psychological compulsion. We're talking about what, if anybody ever took psychology, positive psychology, almost like a self-actualization, right? I want to be a complete self-agent where I determine things in line with grace and virtue. I mean, I know I'm not saying those things, but please understand those are implied. And then we will follow a freedom known as theonomy. Is there anything else on that slide, those of you that have them up front? I don't,
Definition of the.
oh, there is? Oh, there we go.
Is theonomy?
You know what I mean? Yeah.
Yes.
Is the
It's on
definition?
there.
Yes, that would be a definition for theonomy. Just so you, keep in mind that when I use the word goods in this sense, I'm using the word goods to mean desires. We always, unfortunately, are sometimes choosing apparent goods. They satisfy us in the meantime. They're the spiritual carbohydrates. And as you know as well as me in life, rarely do we choose between goods and evils. We are normally choosing between competing goods. Which we're going to see after the break, that's a significant part of us being made in God's image. Okay. Now, I put these up here so you don't have to write them. Although there's going to be one that lays over this. Religious freedom for us is a source of dignity. So when people are pursuing beliefs that are in opposition to us, we have to recognize the dignity of that individual is pursuing truth, albeit either a partial truth or an error that they are seeing as a truth. But the connection between us and them is we're both pursuing truths, are we not? We are. So, dignitatis humanae, all men should be at once impelled by nature. I won't read the whole thing.
Ours is different, actually.
Yours is different.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah,
Yeah.
ours is from doubting the steps.
Oh, okay, then I know what happened. That'll show up second. It must be underneath this. Okay. Then I'll just pass it over.
This is something we should write down.
No, this, you can write down dignitatis humanae. It's actually going to come up at the bottom of the slide. I had one on top of the other, so I didn't try to cover your text. I must have made them out of order.
I don't see it.
Okay, so we hear things about primacy of conscience. In other words, the Catholic Church says you have to follow your conscience. I mean, we have a hard time thinking that if somebody feels compelled to do something, that we're going to make you go against your conscience. But that leaves us in a pickle. I mean, consciences aren't the end thing that determines the truth. So what do we do here? So we know that a subjective or an erring conscience still imputes guilt. Impute guilt means you're still responsible. Just because you got it wrong and you thought it was right, you'll hear terms people won't use. They might say it doesn't bother my conscience. Well, sometimes serial killers can say that. I mean, you could really sear your conscience shut. Or somebody might just use other words like, I could sleep at night, doesn't bother me. Yeah, well, you just screwed your whole family out of inheritance. You know, how do you sleep at night? Well, I have no problem. Okay, but you have an erring conscience. Here's John Henry Newman, his letter to the Duke of Norfolk, when this phrase often comes up because people who want to assert their own autonomy from magisterial teachings will point to this and say, well, didn't Newman say, I will drink to the Pope if you please, but to conscience first and to the Pope afterwards? Didn't he say that? Sure did. But what context was it in? He wasn't talking about things that have been determined from our nature. He was talking about things that may be in question. I actually think the one example I read was, could you impose a lottery, on parishes in order to raise money? Well, no. You mean, what would that come from? I'm not doing that. So, there are things that, yes, that the Pope may suggest, but we're welcome to consider it, but our conscience first. If anybody remembers the line from Joan of Arc when she was sitting in front of, I guess it was the Archbishop or the Cardinal, and her advisor knew that she would be tricked into going against church teaching. In other words, he's going to pose questions to you. And if you don't answer them correctly, they will say you're opposed to what the church has been revealed to the church by Christ. So he said your answer should always be, as I will do that, provided Christ is served first. It's a good answer. That type of thing. Okay, there's your Gaudium et Spes. So let me back up here so I can... I'll just leave it up there. For whatever reason, it doesn't dawn on me what I thought the absolute connection was there right then. So Thomas Aquinas says, we must therefore conclude that absolutely speaking, every will, at variance with reason, whether right or erring, is always evil. So we have this interplay between our conscience and then what the church teaches, and it seems like it's a catch-22, that a well-formed conscience will be in line with what the church teaches. Well, then am I not just doing what the church teaches me? How am I following my conscience? You know, but you at least have something in your belt now to answer that, and saying, okay, but you're treating this almost like a child is looking at, I have to follow negative precepts. You're not looking at this like there's actually something within our nature that's been revealed to the church for our behalf. So our conscience must be formed because in light of what God's design was and how he wants us to live out our life, that will bring us the greatest amount of freedom. So yes, a well-formed conscience will be in line with the church teaching. That being said, remember back to an earlier statement that not everything has been determined. Your conscience on whether or not you should become or finish in the diaconate is entirely up to you. That's something that you determine. That's not something, so your conscience would come to bear on that. Or even if you would propose yourself as a candidate, correct? And we all know how, like for any documents, we know how to cite Thomas Aquinas. If not, I'll put that up there. Summa Theologica, Prima Secunda, first part of the second part, question 19. Article 5, and then the CO is like it's the I respond. Well, I could put that up there. Okay. See, I already said it. I knew it's in my thinking there. There's hardly ever just going to be one course to take. And okay, this is the last slide for this. Let me take a break. That's John Henry Newman again. It says, conscience is at once the highest of all teachers, yet it's the least luminous. And we're in a fallen state. So that plus the way that we have lived life and formed habits and other psychological barriers can really impede our ability to form our conscience well. It never makes an evil act good. It's always a matter of guilt. How much guilt does it impute? Anybody that knows anyone who may have suffered sexual abuse carry things that I could not imagine carrying. They could fall into certain habits that I never had to deal with. No matter what they do, if it's evil, it's evil. But the level of guilt is going to change. It's a trite way to say it, but again, I don't suffer from any inclination towards alcoholism. For me to drink 2 glasses of wine or beer and stop is easy for me. Somebody else may not have that ability. So if we both fell into alcoholism and degraded our health, it's an evil for both of us. I'm more guilty. They fought they have a bigger fight to go against than I did. In the end, Veritatis Splendor says, just recall that human freedom never creates values. It discovers them. Human freedom is always lined up with our nature and always lined up with what is good for us, happiness, beatitude, virtue. So virtue and the law of freedom, a well-formed conscience is an antidote to both pragmatism and consumerism. In other words, pragmatism, just doing what's, readily worth doing at the moment. There's a better word for it, and I can't think of it right now. Expedient, or simply consumerism. And there's no way to impose virtue on the masses. We can't do that. So Cardinal Dulles says, whatever crisis is going on in society, it's just the crisis of the individual writ large. So we just change ourselves. We're always fighting pleasure, power, and prestige. He says it's also an aid to democracy. If freedom is the highest state of the civil society, then people need to understand political freedom. So we're in a situation where wouldn't we love it if every voter was an informed voter? Even if they voted opposite what we voted. Wouldn't we love it if they were well informed and understood what political freedom is? And the last thing, environmental ethics. We never stop to think that the use of the resources in our world is really a manifestation of our freedom. Do we let the water run when we brush our teeth? We'll talk about environmental ethics. We won't talk per se about climate change and global warming, but I will share this. It's not going to make a difference if we don't just live differently. It doesn't matter what we do if we don't live differently. My mother, God bless her, never would throw away water. If she drank a glass of water and didn't finish it, she would wrap saran wrap and a rubber band around it. She figured, why throw it down the drain? Can you imagine if we all did that? We will have to start questioning the size houses we live in, the vacations that we take. All these things that we think are just part of our normal life, they add to a consumer attitude. Again, and I'll tell the story more fuller later, my mother, little Italian neighborhood, where we all moved away, turned into like meth lab area. MS-13 gangs coming in. They were breaking into people's homes, stealing money. They broke into her house. They found a $20 bill. Do you think if somebody broke into my house or your house, the only thing they could find of value is a $20 bill? She had nothing to steal. I mean, the joke was back in 2008 when the recession hit, I told one of my kids, I said, somebody call Grammy Bueno and tell her we're hitting a recession. She wouldn't have known. Now, if we all lived in this simplistic lifestyle, any concern for global warming would end tomorrow. But we don't. So we never think about environmental ethics tied into freedom and virtue, but it is.